1980, a quiet Argentine architect, Adolfo Pérez Esquivel, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The award to this relatively unknown man over other candidates, Jimmy Carter, Lord Carrington, Robert Mugabe, and even Pope John Paul II, was based on his work in the human rights organization which he directs from Buenos Aires. More important, the award by the Nobel Committee reveals a worldwide concern with the brutality still exercised by the military juntas in the Southern Cone. These countries, Argentina, Uruguay and Chile, Paraguay, Bolivia and Brazil, were all front-page news in the early and mid-1970s, mainly because of the ferocity with which they suppressed dissent. The murder of President Allende in Chile in the coup led by General Pinochet, who apparently intends to retain control of his country until 1997, was widely condemned when it took place in 1973. Many thousands of people were either executed or were kidnapped by security forces and are still categorized as missing or disappeared and presumed dead. Far from subsiding with time, this official state violence has continued throughout the 1970s and into the 80s. As a study of Amnesty International documents reveals, there is no end in sight. Of these military dictatorships, the first to take power was that of General Stroessner in Paraguay. That was in 1954. Some 27 years later, after some farcical elections, he remains in power. To provide peace and stability, Stroessner has maintained an official state of siege since 1954, lifting it on only 6 occasions, and on 5 of them for a mere 24 hours, to coincide with elections. The justification for this strong-arm approach, the threat of so-called communist subversion. A piece of trivia: given this fierce right-wing repression, it is not surprising that several hundred German Nazis sought refuge there after World War II. The most infamous is Dr. Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death in Auschwitz concentration camp, who has lived in Paraguay since 1959. Life for rural Paraguayans is pathetic. In 1978, average rural income per year was estimated at $137 US. Only 7% of the population has access to safe water. Despite one of the highest ratios of cultivable land per capita in the world, only a little over 2% of the total land was under cultivation as recently as 1970. With an unofficial inflation rate in 1979 of 62%, it is no wonder that 1/4 of all Paraguayans are living outside the country, the highest rate of emigration in all Latin America. Perhaps one case history from Amnesty International's files sums up well the realities of life in rural Paraguay, and too the rule of so-called law and order. In March of 1980, 7 peasants, including 2 wounded women and a 12-year-old girl, disappeared, later were listed as killed in a shootout. Apparently, a group of peasants had stopped a bus and demanded to be taken to the capital, where they hoped to draw attention to their eviction from land by powerful landlords. The government responded by sending some 5,000 soldiers to restore order and destroy this subversion. The 7 corpses were the result of this action. At the other end of the scale, but only in some ways, is Argentina, which regards itself as the most sophisticated, refined and Europeanized nation in Spanish America. Unfortunately, the human rights situation in that country is far worse than that of Paraguay. Indeed, the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Pérez Esquivel, who was himself jailed and tortured, is eloquent testimony of the appalling situation in Argentina. We recently contacted him in his Buenos Aires office.
The objective of the group Paz y Justicia, in English Peace and Justice, is to help develop the dignity of man in all its dimensions, both spiritually and socially. The situation of human rights in all Latin America is very difficult at the moment. This is because the abuse of human rights is not something that develops in one particular country. Instead, This has repercussions that can be seen wherever the doctrine of the so-called national security is found. The military authorities have a vision of man, a philosophy, and understanding of what the people's solidarity can lead to. They are therefore react against this, but it's important to bear in mind that the human rights situation is not just a case of showing the extreme situation in one country or another. Instead, the struggle for human rights should also be to explain the causes which are responsible for their basically unjust structures. Having said that, two of the problems that concern us at the present are the situation of children who have disappeared, kidnapped by the security services, and their oppression of clergy. Are there solutions to this basic injustice? I think so, particularly as people continue becoming more aware of the problem and joining together to demand their rights.
Sí.
Is there a light at the end of the tunnel? We always have that hope. If we didn't, we wouldn't.
Sí.
We're working in this area. It's our objective to help to find concrete solution to this difficult situation, and we will continue.
Human rights organizations have been prime targets for official repression since the 1976 coup, which deposed President Isabel Perón. General Videla, who led the coup, became president and was succeeded in 1981 by another general, General Viola. In addition to jailing Pérez Esquivel for 14 months, security forces have consistently raided church and legal aid offices, confiscating documentation on the so-called disappeared. In March of 1981, a Canadian student at McGill University was arrested in yet another raid, but after some discussion was released. Argentines captured are not let off so easily. The little boy in this film clip, standing outside the Human Rights Commission, carries a pathetic sign, "Where is my father?" An estimated 15,000 people have disappeared following an abduction and torture and are presumed dead in Argentina. The year of the coup in 1976, there were an estimated 30,000 political prisoners. 1 year later, the church became the target for the military. 17 priests and nuns were murdered. Outspoken Bishop Angelelli was killed in suspicious circumstances, and some 30 religious were jailed. The future continues to look bleak since the government there, with Washington's generous assistance, is determined to stamp out the cancer of international subversion. Targets of the massive government repression are suspected members of left-wing groups. All political parties were declared illegal after the coup, and trade unions. In addition, badly persecuted are teachers, students, intellectuals, religious, lawyers, some 60 of whom were arrested the year of the coup, and journalists. Between 1976 and 1978, at least 38 journalists were murdered because of their criticism of the government. Robert Cox, editor of the English language and rather conservative newspaper, the Buenos Aires Herald, was forced to leave the country recently after he and his family received death threats. In Argentina, these are taken quite seriously. Because of the power of the armed forces, nobody basically can stop them. They have the legal right to arrest anybody, search any building, and in general impose their will upon a helpless population. These scenes show a visit to one of the shanty towns in Buenos Aires. Everyone is suspect. All have to be interrogated. There is no escape here from the military. The types of torture applied to political prisoners in Argentina are quite horrific. According to sworn testimony and Amnesty International research, they include physical beatings, submersion in baths of water and human excrement, electric shock treatment to the tongue and genitals, and perhaps worst of all, mock executions. It was claimed recently that prisoners have been given powerful sedatives, loaded into aircraft and thrown into the sea, alive but unconscious. Often, to ensure that the victim can withstand the maximum punishment without actually dying, doctors are present to monitor this torture. Typical case is that of Gustavo Westerkamp, who, according to Amnesty International files, like an estimated 1,000 other political prisoners, is held in preventive detention by a special presidential decree. Jailed since 1975, but without any charges being laid, Westerkamp was tortured for 2 days while handcuffed and blindfolded. The 1980 Amnesty International report details this torture. He was given electric shocks and beaten on the genitals with chains. His blindfold was sprayed with tear gas, which caused burns about his eyes. He was left lying on the floor, and those who passed kicked him and spat and urinated on him. For us here in Canada, it's very difficult to visualize such inhumanity, yet for thousands upon thousands of Latin Americans, these barbaric practices are daily routine. Two other examples of Argentina's trampling over basic human rights. In addition to the so-called subversives treated so appallingly, evidence has been found to suggest that children are also made to disappear. Many have been taken from their subversive parents and sent away to distant orphanages, or also been illegally adopted, often in other countries of the Southern Cone. Finally, in late 1979, as Amnesty details, the government passed a new bill stating that all those who reported disappeared during the last 5 years were to be declared officially dead. This means, of course, that families cannot take any legal proceedings to investigate the so-called disappearance. An official door simply slams shut on all their hopes. The most recent coup in Latin America took place recently in Bolivia, a poor landlocked country in the heart of South America. Conditions there are pretty grim. Life expectancy is about 48 years, and more than a third of the population is totally illiterate. And while the highest 5% of the population receives an annual salary of $2,115, the bottom 20% survives on a pathetic $59. A British delegation from the National Union of Mine Workers published a report in 1979 on conditions at Bolivia's major tin mines. Bearing in mind that, in comparison with the peasants, these mine workers are an elite, their findings are revealing. The average daily wage is about $2. Company houses provided for workers, and I quote, have one room measuring 4 meters square, a small patio 2 meters square, and a small kitchen 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters. There are usually 8 people living in the house, which has no toilet, no running water, and electricity for only limited periods. The rooms have no windows. End of quote. So much for the elite. The present-day governments of Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, all headed by military juntas, of course, share another thing in common. Within the last 8 years, each has seen the leader chosen in national elections deposed by the new military masters. Allende in Chile, Isabel Perón in Argentina, released from house arrest in July 1981, and Siles Suazo in Bolivia. In each case, the military intervened because they disagreed with the politics of the newly elected government. Do it my way, they seem to arrogantly order, or we don't play. General Banzer, seen here in this slide, seized power in 1971 using such a popular route. In the case of Siles Suazo, who had earlier been elected president of Bolivia from 1956 to 1960, the military had reasons to be afraid. For not only did he head a coalition of left-of-centre parties, the Marxist cancer yet again, but his treatment of the army in his earlier presidency had shocked them. In 1957, the army numbered 8,000 men, over 2,000 of whom were permanently employed doing useful things like building roads, according to a recent study. Unlike most other Latin American nations, the military received a small percentage of the national budget, only 6.7%. Indeed, the army commander complained that they couldn't even afford to buy batteries for the trucks, which were kept parked on the steep streets of the capital so they could be bump-started. Now, the same president had been re-elected, and thanks to generous assistance from their Argentine military colleagues, they were determined not to be caught out again. Here we see Lydia Guyla, president of the Bolivian Congress, being appointed interim president in November 1979 after yet another failed coup attempt. The military might swear allegiance to the constitution and democratic process now, but it was not to last. The military rose in July 1980, 7 days after the election results were known. By mid-August, more than 500 people had been killed, 2,000 wounded, and more than 2,500 jailed. A large number had also disappeared. The church was particularly badly treated. Priests and religious were beaten and threatened with death. The radio station, Radio Fides, was also totally destroyed, and all constitutional guarantees were suspended. The Organization of American States and the Andean Pact condemned the coup, and in the face of a national strike, the economy was kept ticking over thanks to a $70 million loan allegedly from the cocaine growers of Santa Cruz. Annual revenue from the sale of cocaine is estimated at $600 million US, worth far more than any other single legal export in Bolivia. General Videla in Argentina offered a loan of $200 million US and the promise to buy large quantities of natural gas at double the market price. Actually, the Argentine connection in helping the so-called cocaine coup is quite extensive. Large numbers of Argentine advisors arrived to assist the Bolivian army a few months before. Le Monde estimates there were at least 200 military personnel in the country at that time. Many of those tortured also noted Argentinian accents on their interrogators, birds of a feather apparently flocking together. The model of many of these developments is, of course, the Chilean coup of 1973, when President Salvador Allende was overthrown by the military under the leadership of General Pinochet. 3 years later, Maclean's alleged that 90,000 people had been arrested and some 30,000 executed or had died under torture. Since the coup, there have been many startling developments. The UN General Assembly condemned Chile in December 1978. The Pinochet junta prohibited the visit to Chile by a UN Commission on Human Rights. Similarly, in September 1976, it forbade a delegation of 3 Canadian members of Parliament, Andrew Bruin, Louis Duclos, and David MacDonald, from visiting Chile. One of the junta members, Gustavo Lee, disturbed apparently at the continued repression and at Pinochet's plans to continue as the strongman, resigned. Perhaps the most damaging for Chile's credibility, however, was its role in what has been called the Letelier case. In 1976, Orlando Letelier, the foreign minister in the Allende cabinet, along with an American research assistant, Ronnie Moffett, were killed when a bomb exploded in their car in Washington, D.C. After extensive investigation, the U.S. applied for an extradition request against 3 Chilean officers, including General Contreras, head of the Chilean secret police. U.S. authorities had sufficient evidence that the 3 had been responsible, along with American citizen Michael Townley, for the assassination. The Chilean Supreme Court denied the official U.S. extradition request and was roundly condemned in world legal circles. For wealthy Chileans, life continues much as always. In fact, if you have the money, there are more consumer items than ever. It is a case then of cleaning up the economy to the benefit of the rich. Yet in 1979, according to the Women's Interchurch Council of Canada, some 44% of children under 6 cared for by the Catholic relief organization, the Vicariate of Solidarity in Santiago, suffered from malnutrition. From an average of $48 a head spent on public health under Allende, as well as free milk, as this mural indicates, the military junta now spends only $14 a head. To give some idea of their recent priorities, spending on public health was 2.4% of the budget, and on defense, 45%. The military presence is again keenly felt. Every 6 months since the 1973 coup, the government has renewed the state of emergency. This means that all political parties remain banned and all political activity is prohibited. At the end of November 1979, for example, 46 members of the right-of-centre Christian Democrat Party were detained by security forces. Some 2,000 were arrested for political reasons in 1979 and early 1980. mainly for participating in peaceful public demonstrations. Most of those arrested were taken to secret detention centers and tortured, according to Amnesty International. In 1981, this situation continued to deteriorate, and at one point a Canadian priest, Father Patrick Donovan, was also arrested, to be released after a popular outcry. Yet the situation remains grim for the secret police, in the words of the president of the powerful Organization of American States Human Rights Committee. For the government, he says, continues to practice, and I quote, the successful Chilean model for eliminating rivals. To illustrate just what this means for people, a case history reported in Maclean's in November of 1980. Spring had fallen softly on Santiago when they came for her. 11 men with guns thundering down upon the tiny student cafe, dragging Inés Angelica Díaz Tapia, screaming, into an unmarked car. 4 days later, her sister caught sight of her before a military tribunal, ravaged beyond her 25 years. She was unable to stand upright. In those 4 days earlier this year, in a cafe house of the Central Nacional de Informaciones, she had been stripped and changed the metal torture grid called the parrillo. Slowly, with exquisite attention to detail of the truly professional, they had beaten her all over her body, twisting the lighted cigarettes into her breasts and thighs. Each time she passed out with the pain, she awoke to a doctor's ministrations. He did not dress her wounds, but revived her to assure her that she was conscious for the worst part that was yet to come. The searing jolts of an electric shock rod roaming her flesh, then rammed deep into her private parts. In court, when she tried to cry out to her sister, an attendant slapped her across the face and led her away. An excellent account in Maclean's in late March of 1981 was entitled Friends in Shady Places, and discussed the visit of Argentina's new president, General Viola, to Washington. Apparently, the Reagan administration is not concerned by the brutality of repression in the Southern Cone. Instead, they had earlier hosted military envoys from Chile, Brazil, and Bolivia. Others from Guatemala, another major human rights offender, are to be invited to Washington soon. Now, the human rights issue, prominent in the first 2 years of Jimmy Carter's presidency, have been replaced by concerns of hemispheric security. What it boils down to is that, unlike Carter's initial period, Reagan is not in the least interested in the human costs. What matters now is to have as many strong right-wing dictatorships, protecting foreign investment in their countries and keeping the countries in the US orbit. In the early 19th century, the Monroe Doctrine said more or less the same thing. Since that time, unfortunately, the United States' political role has not been encouraging in Latin America. Since 1850, for example, there have been some 69 direct military interventions by US forces in Latin America. There have also been indirect interventions precipitating the overthrow of elected governments in Guatemala in 1954, Brazil 1964, where in Brazil, by the way, 80% of the officers participating in the coup had been trained by the US, and Chile, of course, in 1973. US Ambassador to Chile, Edward Corey, has shown how, in his words, the Nixon-Kissinger-Helms team asked me to consider the military overthrow of Allende even before he was elected. Later, some $13 million was contributed by the US government to help overthrow Allende. This role of the United States, not widely commented upon by the popular media, is indeed a can of worms. Between 1950 and 1975, for instance, the United States trained some 72,000 military personnel from Latin America, including no less than 8 of the region's current dictators, and gave some $2.5 billion in armaments. All of the countries studied today have benefited militarily from the Reagan election. This is particularly ironic. The New York Times recently pointed out because, and I quote, "These are the countries that the Carter administration condemned for political killings and torture, and from which it withheld military aid." We have a 180-degree about turn then by US government policy on this issue. The problem, of course, revolves around three related matters: heavy US investment in Latin America, the knee-jerk reaction to the communist octopus, which European leaders regard as ridiculous, and on the other side, the desire by the many Latin Americans to achieve a decent standard of living. The writer Penny Lernoux has put the dilemma quite well. I quote, "Everybody is so busy developing strategies to combat communism that all have really completely overlooked the basic causes of the people's misery. Nearly 5 centuries of social and economic repression. As long as the dictators proclaimed their fealty to the United States and their abhorrence of communism, Washington was prepared to support them with military and economic aid." Put more directly, Franklin Roosevelt is reputed to have said about the first Somoza, who, by the way, was helped and shored up by the US government when he first took power. He said, "He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." That sums up rather well the closed-minded approach to the pathetic situation of human rights in Latin America. As we're currently seeing in El Salvador, more of the same remedy is in store for the area. This heavy-handed approach to the human rights situation is really too bad, for there are literally tens of thousands of people who have been assassinated and brutally tortured during the last decade. Dozens of children have disappeared in Argentina. In the last 8 years, 1 in every 50 Uruguayans has been arrested at least once. Can we really turn a blind eye to the suffering? For the sake of humanity, maybe we should listen to the Church, which has seen an estimated 900 religious assassinated in Latin America over the last 12 years. We can conclude by citing Cardinal Aloysio Loscheida, President of the Brazilian Conference of Bishops. The rationale of security is not acceptable when it means destroying human beings.